Hello, and welcome to another edition of Climate Talks. As the world is waiting for climate guidance and leadership from the discussions and negotiations being held in Glasgow at COP26, we are bringing to you views and perspectives from climate change experts and leaders attending this summit. Just imagine where would we be if the forecasting of weather events was not possible. Preparations to prevent potential disasters would almost be impossible if we did not react to the projections that science offers us. Our main contributing guest this week is Professor Petteri Taalas, Secretary General of the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. And talking to Mr. Taalas on our behalf was Russell Isaac.
Mr. Taalas, COP26 is at the centre of all climate talks at the moment, of course. How does the World Meteorological Organization view this particular event?
Of course, this is very important COP. We had a very important COP in Paris 5 years ago, and here we are supposed to discuss the follow-up of the Paris Agreement. And from our perspective, we are not on track towards this 1.5 to 2 degrees, and we are rather moving towards 2.5 to 3 degrees range by the end of this century. And from our side, we have been publishing a couple of scientific reports just before this COP to demonstrate that we have actually seen negative development when it comes to emissions of main greenhouse gases. We again broke a record of carbon dioxide concentration. It was growing despite of the lockdowns last year by 2.5 ppm. And there was a drop of emissions by 5.6% last year. So despite of that, this negative trend continues. Same is true for methane and nitrous oxide, which are the three main greenhouse gases. Then we have seen a boost in the melting of glaciers, and that's bad news when it comes to water availability. The population is going to suffer of water shortages because of that during the coming decades. We have seen a boost in sea level rise. It used to be about 2 millimeters per year 20 years ago, and recently we have been observing 4.4 millimeters per year. And then, of course, we have seen lots of extreme events worldwide, and some of them wouldn't have been possible without the impact of climate change. For example, the flooding in Germany was something very unusual, and also the heat waves in Canada and Western USA, they were unusual, and they wouldn't have been possible without the impact of climate change. We have broken records also in Siberia and Italy when it comes to temperatures, and these heat waves are becoming more frequent because of climate change. And so far we have seen about 1.5 to 1 to 1.2 degrees warming, and in the coming 20 years, it's likely that we will reach the low limit of Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees. So there's certain urgency, and with the facts that we are providing, we are motivating the heads of state and negotiators to proceed with the climate mitigation things. And for us, adaptation is also highly important. We have to adapt to this change because the negative trend in these weather patterns will continue until 2060s. And we already have such a high concentration of carbon dioxide that, for example, the melting of glaciers and sea level rise will continue for the coming hundreds of years anyhow.
Mr. Taalas, how can the challenges to reach the last mile with early warnings be overcome in South Asia?
So we have fairly advanced countries in Asia, for example, in Japan, which we regard as a department store of disasters. They have all possible disasters, and they have created a very fancy way of handling these kind of cases. They have the whole countries activated once a high impact weather event hits them. The national broadcasting company and the parliament and all of the actors, they know what to do, and they can minimize the impacts of these events. But they have also learned their lessons by having, for example, this Sendai Fukushima catastrophe some years ago, which led to improvement of their services. and then we have this. Everything depends on the development stage of a country. In less developed countries, usually these services are not so advanced, and that's why they are more vulnerable, and that's why both the human losses and the economic losses they are higher than in richer countries. And as WMO, we are very much sharing the good know-how from our most advanced members towards for those who need assistance, and we have seen also positive development. For example, a country called Vietnam has been investing in their basic observing systems and their early warning service skills, and they can nowadays cope with the typhoons and heavy rain events in a much better fashion than before. And the whole machinery from the early warnings to the concrete action at the authority and businesses level is functioning much better. And we have been able to actually minimize the amount of casualties. Still in the 70s, there were even millions of people who died because of these events, and this number has been dropping thanks to the early warning services. But not all of the countries still don't have proper services, and this work needs to be continued.
Because of the increased frequency and severity of these weather events in South Asia, what should the focus of the governments be therefore to adapt to these events?
So besides climate mitigation, which is of course high priority, we should pay attention to climate adaptation, and that's happening at the moment. We will see this negative trend in weather patterns to continue until 2060s, and certain parameters like sea level rise and melting of the glaciers will continue for the coming hundreds of years. So we have to adapt to these changes, and one very powerful way to adapt to climate change is to invest in early warning services, and you get typically the money back even 20-fold that you invest in those services. So it's also economically viable investment.
And to reach the target of 1.5 degree centigrade and net zero carbon emissions by 2030, what should South Asia countries be doing? How are they likely to steer their processes?
So of course, one of the biggest challenges is to get rid of use of fossil energy. So we have to convert our energy fleet from coal-fired ones to become based on renewable energy, solar, wind, which is where the potential is high, and also we have to build more nuclear energy to be successful there. And then we have to convert our transport systems to be based on electric vehicles, biofuels, and in the longer run perhaps based on hydrogen technologies, and also rice paddies. They are producing methane, which is also one of the greenhouse gases. So this consumption of rice is also sensitive part, and also once we produce red meat, we at the same time we have to deforest some areas, and that should be stopped. And deforestation of especially the rainforests, that's also a positive thing to act against climate change. And here in Glasgow, many countries have already signed this Forest Act, and especially this deforestation of the rainforests. That should be stopped. We have already seen a negative example from Amazonia region, which used to be a major carbon sink. According to our recent measurements, it has become the source of carbon, and that shouldn't happen in the in South Asian rainforests.
And finally, Mr. Taalas, from the WMO perspective, should the people of the region start to feel confident that the work you're doing, the technologies you're investing in, is going to actually reduce the risk of disasters in the future from these natural events?
So we have all the technological means to be successful, and we have also the economic means to be successful, and the governments have to set the frame for this, and then the private sector investors and we as consumers, we could solve this problem. And this mitigation is from a human perspective and also from the perspective of economy a good thing to do, instead of living with the negative consequences of climate change.
Mr. Taalas, thank you for taking part in climate talks.
Thank you.
A very frank and down-to-earth assessment from one of the world's climate experts. In reaction to his comments, we sought the views of two other eminent climate experts. Professor Buddhi Marambe, Faculty of Agriculture, University of Perdania, Sri Lanka, and Mr. Muhammad Arif Goheer, who is Head of Agriculture and Coordination, Ministry of Climate Change, Pakistan. Both are attending the COP26, and it's Russell Isaac once again who is leading the discussion.
We have with us on Climate Talks today Mr. Arif Goheer from Pakistan and Professor Buddhi from Sri Lanka. Now, given the context of Professor Taalas's interview, he was referring to glacial melts, he was referring to intense heat waves, sea level rise. Let me ask you first of all, Professor Buddhi, in practical terms, what can be done?
Yeah, when you say glacial melts, it's not related to Sri Lanka, but it's a direct relationship I'm talking about. But sea level rise matters a lot for a country like ours. We are an island nation, so every inch in the coastal belt is get affected. And our agriculture is in deep trouble when you look at the coastal belt agriculture especially. Okay, what can be done in a country like ours? Let me put the country context first. I think that is important rather than looking at the global scenario. It's the coastal erosion what matters a lot for us in our case. So a lot of measures have been taken to make sure the coastal erosion is minimized to the best possible extent around the country. And then comes the agriculture part. There are two ways that we are trying to tackle it. The agriculture segment. One way is to make sure that there are varieties that are tolerant to saline conditions, especially in the case of paddy, because that's a crop which is which puts our major staple into action. So we always have made every effort to breed rice varieties that will suit different climatic conditions in our country. Saline tolerance, salinity tolerance in one such thing. So I think that's a big breakthrough that we have had over the years, and I think something that countries like ours, who are actually working on a very thin budget margin, I must tell you, can work out to make sure that we either adopt by doing that, and also to make sure we have investments to protect our coastal belt from erosion. Those are the two things a country like us can do definitely.
Mr. Goheer, of course, glacial melt is very, very relevant to Pakistan.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan, most of the area lies in arid to semi-arid, and we have the dwindling rainfalls over there. And as per the studies carried out by Center, it says that if by the end of the century the temperature is going to be 4 degrees C, the Pakistan will be almost 1 degree higher than the global average. And unfortunately, this rise in temperature is more in northern part of the country. Means that there will be more glacier melt over there. Then there is another phenomena in that glaciated areas. We have the world's highest glaciers over there, Karakoram, Hindu Kush, and Himalayas. But as far as Karakoram is concerned, there is I can say, the science is not clear on it, and we say it is a Karakoram anomaly because most of the glaciers in Karakoram are not receding. But on the other hand, if you look at the Hindu Kush ranges, then there we see more unprecedented Gulf events over there on the coming days. And the result is the communities are vulnerable, they are displaced from there. So this is a huge problem arising from these sort of glaciers for us. And another thing is the pattern of glacier melt. Since the temperature is getting higher more in the April months or May months, means that the glaciated water that usually comes to be in the June, it now comes in April. But we have no storage. That means that the if no storage is there, it can't be utilized for agriculture. It goes into the rivers and then into the streams. So we have a GLOF project in Pakistan right now, under which we are establishing the early warning systems, so as to forewarn the communities that are living in those areas. Secondly, we are resorting on the development of mini dams over there, so that the water can be stored and it can be used for the agriculture and other purposes.
Professor Taalas did say actually that the region needs to prepare for negative weather probably until 2060. So adaptation policies, well, they're imperative for all governments, aren't they?
You're quite right. Sri Lanka actually adopted this national climate change policy in 2012. They are tackling both mitigation as well as adaptation. And of course, we did our first national adaptation plan in 2016, and we have already submitted the NDCs also this year, July 31st. Right, apart from that, when you look at the preparedness work, apart from those things, we have already established a disaster management center. As Arif was talking about, this early warning part is extremely important for us. And there's a disaster management center, and we have the cabinet of ministers have already agreed upon on a disaster management action plan, mainly looking at these extreme weather patterns that the Sri Lanka has experienced in the recent past. So things are in place, but of course, we learn a lot when tsunami hit hard in Sri Lanka in 2004. Well, that's not a frequent event. We do understand that part, but things of that nature, extremes of that nature, has to be tackled. And that's how we started preparing from that point onwards, not expecting another tsunami, but of course to extreme weather conditions. So I think Sri Lanka, in terms of policy, in terms of plans, we are well positioned in the system. But of course there are implementation issues, I must tell you, when you look at all those things. But still, the setting is there right now. So it's a matter of implementing these things. Of course, things are taking place. There are a lot of experimental activities are going on. Lot of trials being done to make sure keep people informed. That's the most important thing, isn't it? You can have everything on paper. If the people do not understand the reality, then there will be a problem. So those are the actions that we have taken in Sri Lanka right now.
Are you in Pakistan also preparing up to 2060 or even further possibly?
Yeah, if you look at the extreme events profile in the country, and we have seen that during 1980 till 20, if we were having 25 events, but from 20 till 2020, we have almost 70 events. I mean, the events has become threefold. It includes floods events, it includes disaster episodes, includes heat waves, increased cyclonic activities. So these are the few of the things. Unfortunately, despite of having national climate change policy way back in 2012, as a follow-up, there was a framework for the implementation of climate policy, but still we are preparing our national adaptation plan. Yes, you are right that we are in this fourth state of adaptation, and the impacts are very much evident of the climate change. For example, the studies say that by the mid of the century, the yields of major crops will be reduced to 20 to 25%. So major interventions are needed in agriculture, especially in water use efficiency enhancing. These are the key areas on which the government is keenly focusing on. We are paying weightage to climate smart agriculture these days, not only for the perspective of making resilience and reducing the yield deteriorations, but also for the purpose of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture.
You mentioned earlier, Professor Buddhi, the early warning systems, but what capacity does Sri Lanka have to adopt these early warning systems routinely and effectively?
That's $1 million question, I must tell you. The capacity, in the sense, the capacity development, the continuous upgrade is the key. And that's where we have been talking a lot, even in, Coronavirus Joint Work on Agriculture, where I'm attending for the past 7 years, for example. We've always said that countries like Sri Lanka has capacity. We have the technology right now. But what we require is the knowledge on upgrades, continuous upgrades, and how to keep our people prepared, more importantly, in their mindset, to make sure to trust the system in the most, trusting the system is the most important part, and also effectively implementing that. For that, you need continuous upgrades. And that's where we have a challenge, where we need assistance from many country parties to support us in a country like Sri Lanka to develop these things further.
Is it knowledge and upgrades that we're talking about in Pakistan also?
I mean, knowledge and upgradation, as far as the technical institutes are concerned, these are there. We have the capacity to forecast early warnings, not only at the weather systems, but also the seasonal to sub-seasonal. But the real thing is how the actions are tagged and how the community is informed with these things. So this is a real challenge for us. But at the scientific level, the capacities are there. But the actions are not practically translated to reach to the communities that are vulnerable to these.
Can I add one thing to what Arif said? That's quite right. I mean, when you look at Sri Lanka, an island nation, we have the highlands in the center. That central highland change the overall ecosystem in this country, where when the west is wet, the east is dry, and vice versa. And because of this scenario, it has been extremely difficult for us to predict the climate, even in the short run. But as I told you, the capacity development has been taking place there even right now. But we need a continuous leap jump forward, for example, to make sure things happen. And as Arif quite correctly said, to get the message across to the end user at the end. That is where the big hit we are.
Let's bring this discussion to an end by summing up some of the major points that Professor Taalas pointed at. The reduction of fossil fuels is required, the conversion of transport systems, the transformation of agriculture. Now, is this feasible in South Asia, or is it a question of us saying we must make it feasible? Professor Buddhi.
Yeah, that's $1 million question, I must tell you once again. Of course, the willingness is there, but the feasibility of achieving these targets at the set time frame is the biggest problem that we have. I mean, we are expecting Green Climate Fund, for example, to have $100 billion by 2020, but it's a far-reaching goal as far as we see it right now. But leaving those things apart, I'm happy to tell you the political will is there in Sri Lanka, a country like ours. Once again, I'm telling you, we are working on a very thin budget margin, but still we consider those things as prime importance and priorities in our country. But there's always a but in those cases, whether we can achieve those things without the external support coming in. That is where the biggest question that we face right now.
Look, Russell, I see it in the perspective of many ifs and buts. If you say a willingness, yes, willingness is there, and it is reflected in the government's document. The most recent example is the National NDC document in Pakistan, where we have committed that by 2030, we will be having 30% of our new vehicles as electric vehicles. We have committed that there will be no imported coal in the country. We have committed that by the end of 2030, there will be 60% of our energy will be from renewables. You see, we have signed the methane pledge, which aims at reducing the 30% of the methane emissions by the end of 2030. So, I mean, willingness is there. The scientific strategies are there, and we have committed that out of our commitment of reduction of 50% emissions by 2030, 15% will be unconditional. Government will be paying for it, whereas the 35 will be from the international support. So it again, as Professor Buddhi said, it depends upon the support that we are being provided with. We need a major transformation in our agriculture, not only for reducing the emissions, but also for making our agriculture climate resilient. We are ready to reduce emissions from the nitrous oxide, from the fertilizer usage. We are ready to reduce emissions from livestock, methane emissions. So these are part of our greater strategy. And how to do it, we are also aware of it. But how much international community commits support for these actions is the need of the time. We have given many examples. 1 billion, 10 billion tree tsunami project is there. We talked about the nature-based solutions. We talked about the ecosystem restoration initiatives. I think these are plethora of examples that our government has given for the international world. And I invite the international community to come to Pakistan and look at how we are acting on our actions.
Mr. Goheer, Professor Buddhi, thank you for joining us on Climate Talks.
Thank you very much for the
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As usual, plenty of food for thought. In Pakistan, the rising uncertainty of water access and availability brought upon by glacial melting must be a key driving point in strategy and decisions to assist communities and the agriculture sector. The necessary science and technology exists in the country, yet there are still difficulties in using this knowledge to properly inform communities to promote risk-informed decision-making and response. On the other hand, in Sri Lanka, priority must be given to minimizing the impacts of coastal erosion on communities and agriculture sector. A variety of innovations and enabling conditions must be encouraged for climate-smart investments. We'll return to Glasgow for our next edition of Climate Talks before the end of this month. Please join us then if you can, but in the meantime, please forward any comments or questions that you may have to the usual website address, and we will attempt to respond as soon as possible. Thank you once again for joining us. See you next time.